Good morning. I'm Marley Schlanger from the LaRouche organization with your daily video update for October 13th, 2023. It's Friday, and so I usually take questions. Today I'm going to be taking a number of questions that have come out as a result of the discussion of the last days about the ongoing crisis and conflict in the Middle East. There have been, overall, most of you have expressed your support for the call for action to build a higher peace movement and to not be manipulated into taking sides. However, some of you have called me out. Some have said, how can you oppose action against the terrorists, crushing the terrorists of Hamas? The barbaric attack on Israel, how can you accept that? And others of you have said, how can you accept the illegal occupation and murderous attacks on Palestinian civilians? Well, if you were really listening to what I said, if you were paying attention, neither of those charges is true. The question is, how do we get out of the existing geometry in which war seems to be the only alternative? We see it in terms of the Ukraine-Russia situation, that NATO insists on permanent warfare to the end of to the last Ukrainian. Now we're seeing a similar blood fury in the West, insisting that Israel has the right to go in and destroy Gaza, including carry out a siege against 2.4 million who are mostly civilians. What you have to realize is that we're dealing with a situation in which there's a cycle of revenge which long predates the events of last Saturday. And this is where the problem in thinking is. In the Congress, people are largely rewarded for choosing sides in a war. And the U.S. Congress and the executive branch, for the most part in recent years, has been committed to the idea of permanent warfare. For whose benefit? Who in the United States benefits from permanent warfare, other than the corporate cartels, especially of the military-industrial complex, and of the financial cartels that benefit from the use of military to crush any opposition to their policies? But this is something that predates the events of last Saturday. It also didn't even begin in the last 50 years. What we're looking at is a situation which has been manipulated by imperial powers for going back essentially to the time of the American Revolution. I'm not going to go through the whole history, although I will point out that in many key moments between 1776 and the present, Russia has been on the side of the United States. But that's forgotten because people don't know history. Well, I'm going to take a look at the more recent period in the Middle East, going back to 1916, and something called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which was signed in May 1916. Now, I'm sure many of you don't know what this is, and it's worthwhile getting this history before you jump into the argument as to which side is justified and which side is right. The Sykes-Picot Agreement was a secret agreement that was negotiated between the French and the British to carve up the Middle East at a time in which the Ottoman Empire was disintegrating. That is, the Ottoman Empire had dominated that region for a couple of centuries, but it was falling apart internally, and it was also a result of the war of empires with Russia, Austro-Hungarian, British Empire, the Ottoman Empire, all engaged in World War I. So in the middle of World War I, there was a negotiation as to how to carve up this region once the Ottomans were ousted. Now, the British took what's today Israel and Palestine, Jordan, and southern Iraq. The French took southeast Turkey, including the Kurdistan region, Syria, and Lebanon. Now, if you just hear that, it points to some interesting aspects of why this region is still in crisis. But let's go a little deeper. The British maintained their mandate for Palestine until 1948. The French maintained their mandate for Syria and Lebanon until 1946. Now, during this period after the Sykes-Picot Agreement, You had, for example, in November 1917, a letter from British Foreign Secretary Balfour to Lord Rothschild promising, quote, a national home for the Jewish people, unquote. And that's the basis for the claim for legitimacy of the creation of Israel. You have another example, which is caught up in the mythology of history, the battle between Lawrence of Arabia, who was positing the Arabian Peninsula should be under the control of the Hussein family, Sharif Hussein, versus the British, other side of the British, the Indian colonial side, represented by Harry St. John Philby, who was an advisor to Ibn Saud and advocated the domination of the Arabian Peninsula by the Saud dynasty, which became Saudi Arabia. Now, why did the British get to determine that? Well, that's the whole basis of geopolitics. The intent of the British was to control the geographical space between Asia, Europe, and Africa, the crossroads, which intersected or was part of the control of the seas, including the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, the Arabian or Persian Gulf, and the entrance to the Indian Ocean. This was the primary interest of the British in negotiating these kinds of agreements. Now, I want you to listen to what Lyndon LaRouche had to say about this from a speech he gave at Central Connecticut State University in May 2009. And I'm going to be appending a link to this to the description section. He spoke on what he called the End of Sykes-Picot, moving beyond colonialism. So here's what he had to say. Quote, see the Middle East not as having its own history, but the Middle East as something within the process of history. And don't look at the Israeli-Arab conflict. Don't ignore it, but don't look at it. In other words, don't focus on it. Because the conflict is not determined by the Israelis or Arabs. It's not determined by the Israelis or Arabs. It is determined by international forces which look at this region. How? As the crossover point between the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean, the relationship of Europe to Asia, the relationship of Europe to East Africa, and so forth. Therefore, what you're seeing is that. Then he continues. Now go back and say, where did the British get this idea, as they did with Sykes-Picot? Where did they get the bright idea of keeping the Arab population and what became the Israeli population at odds with each other permanently, killing each other over land? And today you sit there in despair and you say, are these people just going to kill themselves into extinction, kill each other into extinction? What's wrong here? And LaRouche answers the question, and this is the point, the central point I've been trying to make, and Helga Zepp-LaRouche has been trying to make, and any serious advocate of diplomacy and peace is trying to make. Here's what LaRouche said. Well, somebody's playing them. Somebody's playing and orchestrating the situation from all sides. And today we look at this and we say intelligence failure. The Israelis were really caught off guard when this, in fact, plays into the desire of many people in Netanyahu's cabinet to ethnically cleanse the Palestinian areas. Now, let me complete the thought from LaRouche. He said, we have to move, therefore, from thinking about conflict among nations and regions to the alternative to conflict by finding that which unites us through common purpose as independent sovereign nations, rather than seeking resolution of a conflict we are now enjoying among ourselves. That's the only chance we have. And when you look at the possibilities for this region, Southwest Asia, the only chance will come not from inside Southwest Asia. We will do and must do what we can for that area to try to stop the bloodshed, the agony, to prevent the war. But we will not succeed until we change the history, change the world in which this region is contained. And that's the idea that Helga Zepp-LaRouche has introduced with this concept of the higher peace movement. Now, what are we dealing with? What LaRouche is addressing is what happened at the end of the Cold War. You had eventually the reemergence of Russia, the economic development of China. And now we're seeing a newfound self-confidence of many nations in the global south who are saying, we will not submit to your rules-based order, your unipolar order, your colonial looting system. We see the break from geopolitics, which is centered around the idea of pitting nations and peoples against one another, the idea that there should be no more blocs, that we should have multilateral or multipolar relations as opposed to unipolar order. No sole superpower imposing a unipolar order. The idea that this is for democracy is easily proven to be false, because the United States today and NATO today are supporting an undemocratic regime in Ukraine in the name of protecting democracy. The idea of the unipolar order, or the rules-based order, is to continue an imperial colonial system, with the beneficiaries being the corporate cartels in finance, the so-called military-industrial complex, the big pharma, and others, to allow them to be free to loot nations, to take their raw materials, their cheap labor, to bail out a collapsing Western financial system. And those nations which resist will be crushed by NATO and the US. Look at what happened in Iraq, in Libya, in Syria, what they're trying to do today to Russia and China. All of these nations oppose this unipolar order. In the case of Iraq and Libya and Syria, they were not strong enough in themselves to defeat the colonial powers, but to try to take on Russia and China in war, as the hawks around Biden and Sunak and Stoltenberg and others are doing, is pure insanity. Risking life on this planet for the sake of protecting a system which has outlived its purpose and can only survive by increasing the rate of killing. So that's why it's foolish to take sides in this conflict. The side has to be the human side. Will killing civilians in Gaza end terrorism, or will it increase the cycle of revenge? Putting an end to colonialism would be the best way to end terrorism, giving all nations, the people of all nations, the right to make sovereign choices as to how they will develop, what kind of relations they should have with other nations, the ability to benefit from their raw materials, from their productive labor force, the use of national currencies instead of everyone being under the dollar, the petrodollar system. This is the way to get out of it and go a step further. Allow nations to live with their cultural, religious, national traditions, as long as there's cooperation for mutual benefit. This goes back to what happened in 1648, what was called the Peace of Westphalia, which ended the 30 Years' War of religion in Europe, which actually goes back even longer to the early 1500s. Nearly 150 years of religious warfare. How did it end? The agreement that there would be no interference in internal affairs of nations, that is, sovereignty, and that nations will act for the benefit of the other, for the benefit of their neighbor. Recognize their prosperity and their security depends on the prosperity and security of other nations as well. In other words, the idea of an order in which sovereign nation states act for mutual benefit. Now, that's coherent with the golden rule of Christianity. Why is that so hard for people in the West to grasp? Well, it's because of the brainwashing of hundreds of years, but especially the post-Cold War period where you have to have an enemy image. And why do you need an enemy image? So that billions, if not trillions, of your tax dollars go to fund a military-industrial complex which benefits a small number of billionaires and a handful of their stockholders, but requires wars to remain profitable as the excuse to not only loot the countries that are under attack, but to loot the people in the countries where the military-industrial complex is. You're being looted for the benefit of Raytheon and Boeing and Lockheed Martin, but also for Chase Manhattan, for Citibank, for Wells Fargo and Bank of America, the City of London. They're experts in this. As LaRouche pointed out, this goes back a long time. Now, I'm going to be linking LaRouche's speech for you, as well as the 10 principles for a new security and development architecture drafted by Helga Zepp-LaRouche. Take some time this weekend to think about this. Those of you who already understand it, take these documents and use them to organize your friends, neighbors, and co-workers. For those of you who still want to pick a fight with me, make sure you're doing it from the standpoint of articulating an actual self-interest, as opposed to choosing sides in a pickup game of neighborhood football. It's really a moment in history where we can end the colonial system for the benefit of all humanity. That's the side you should pick. So thanks for joining me today. I'll be back with you next week. Hello, thanks for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our videos. Support our independence to produce videos like these. Become a member of the LaRouche organization at thelarouche.org/member. By becoming a member for $25 or more, you'll get special access to the EIR Alert Daily Briefing and Weekly Magazine, which is what I read to stay on top of things.